This video showcases research carried out by the Victoria County History of Essex Trust. The Victoria County History is a nationwide project that is over 120 years old and aims to write detailed, source-based histories of every parish or place in England. The VCH Essex Trust works with VCH Central at the Institute of Historical Research in London to research and publish high-quality history books about our county. We've been very busy in the last few years publishing both big red books, which are very comprehensive historical studies of particular places right through to the modern day, and also several VCH shorts, which, as the name suggests, are shorter volumes that aim to bring local research to publication as swiftly as possible and to inspire readers to get involved with VCH ventures in their own localities. Crowe's talk today is based on research carried out by our volunteer group in Southend, which will soon be published as a VCH short. If you're inspired to support the work of VCH Essex, then please do contact us or follow us on social media to find out more.
This talk is based on research carried out by the Southend VCH team, and it looks at visitors to Southend between about 1780 and 1910, and it's divided into 4 phases. The first begins between the origins of Southend as a watering place and the building of Southend Pier. By the second half of the 18th century, the social elite who had been frequenting the inland spas were turning their attention to the seaside. Scarborough, Brighton, Weymouth, and Margate, for example, were among the first of these fashionable watering places. Southend was not far behind. At this time, Southend was a small settlement along the north bank of the Thames, whose economy was based principally on farming and fishing. The discovery that oysters could be successfully bred on the foreshore led to an expansion of the settlement in the 1760s. The settlement extended to the west of Southend Lane, with Southend Common to the east and Facon's or Thames Farm slightly above to the north. In 1764, Mr. Haynes' house on the seafront had been converted to the Ship Tavern. As demand for access to this watering place increased, bathing machines appeared by 1780, and a regular stagecoach service from London to the Ship Tavern at Southend had been inaugurated in 1790, joined by a rival coach company the following year. There were plans to build an elegant hotel in Southend in 1785, although this seems to have progressed no further than this advertisement in the Chelmsford Chronicle. As increasing numbers of genteel visitors made their way to Southend, the Lord of the Manor and principal landowner, Daniel Scratton, promoted the building of an entirely new resort to the west of the existing seaside settlement. This was on the cliff top and was to comprise a grand terrace and hotel and a circulating library, and a smaller terrace and a new road running northwards, linking the new resort to the Shoebury London Road. This new road was to be called High Street. Now, the terrace development was not a success for its developers, who all went bankrupt. The terrace was sold, the principal purchaser being James Haygate. And this is a picture of one of his more famous family, his son, Sir William Haygate. His family was to become prominent landowners and key figures in the development and governance of the town throughout much of the 19th century. Some houses on the terrace were occupied year-round, but most were probably let out in the season. In 1804, Princess Caroline of Wales and her entourage occupied several of the houses on the terrace. Her visit lent royal patronage to the new resort, and the terrace was afterwards known as Royal Terrace. With royal patronage, Southend began to attract the nobility and gentry, and those keen to aspire to that status. Most would have travelled by stagecoach, but with a regular packet steamer service by about 1815, some would have travelled by water. But with no jetty or pier at this time, landing on shore was normally a fairly undignified affair. Many of these fashionable visitors would have stayed at the Ship and Hope taverns on the seafront, and there were also private holiday apartments for letting. We can see in this picture the lower town to the left of the picture, far left of the picture, and towards the middle of the picture, on the cliff top, is the Royal Terrace, and these elegant and genteel visitors on the seafront there. And there's a little rowing boat carrying some visitors, probably from a steam packet, coming towards the shore. As I said, from about 1815, a regular steam packet service ran from London to Margate and then on to Southend. The fare was 5 shillings compared with 21 shillings for the stagecoach. Also, while stagecoaches could carry about 8 people, the steam packet could carry hundreds of passengers. Thus began the first excursions to the seaside. At Margate, which had a pier at this time, there were complaints about the arrival of unfashionable visitors in their resort. This is a rather nice panorama of Southend, drawn about 1820. At this time, the resort of Southend stretched from Royal Terrace in the west, the top picture there, down the slope to the Old Town to the east, and to Paulies Green, and the Vandervoorts' home, the Minerva, and Southend Theatre in the extreme east of the settlement. Paulies Green was one of the several seafront greens which were remnants of the original Southend Common and were used for a variety of entertainments. You probably can't see very clearly there, but on Paulies Green on the bottom picture, there's a little seesaw on the right at the edge of the water, and a group of people playing cricket. Sir William Haygate, the son of James Haygate, who bought much of Royal Terrace, realised that a pier was essential to the future prosperity of the resort, and would, he hoped, result in the increased property values. He was the chief promoter of Southend Pier, and together with a number of other influential residents, he founded the Southend Pier Company in 1829. So Southend's first pier had been completed in 1830. It was 1,500 feet long, with a landing stage known as Mount Misery in deep water, and a causeway linking the two structures. By 1832, the steam packets William IV and the Rose were calling at Southend daily. The landing charges of 6p per passenger at the pier would have deterred at this time all but the fashionable. This is an advertisement in the Chancery Chronicle for these early packet steamer services to Southend. And Southend, as you see, was advertised as the nearest sea bathing place to London, and nervous travellers were assured that passengers were highly respectable. Southend was also advertised as a convenient destination for members of Parliament and other city workers for a short break. In 1846, the pier company were forced to sell the pier to pay off their debts, and the structure had been extended by this time into deep water and was now 1¼ miles long. Henry Choules, landlord of the Royal Hotel, informed the public that Southend will now rank among the favoured watering places. And on the pier head, a small bungalow had been built to house the pier headman and his family. And his job also was to keep the little lighthouse, which you can see on the top picture there, alight at night and in bad weather. At the entrance to the pier was the pier toll house. And just to one side of that was a couple of big signs with the tolls and dues which had to be paid for taking goods on and off the pier. But just to the east side of the pier, attached to the pier itself, was a landing stage and a harbour, say to export and import goods that you had to pay a certain toll depending on what the goods were, things like a barrel of treacle or roof tiles, that sort of thing. In 1846, when the pier was sold, it was purchased by the Eastern Counties Railway, and a horse-drawn tram service was very soon afterwards introduced. This is a much later picture, but you get the idea of the sort of thing. In 1856, the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway reached Southend. The line had been promoted and built by Sir Morton Peto and his business partners, Edward Betts and Thomas Brassey. Now we come to the third phase of our talk, looking at the period between 1860 and 1880. And we get the first organised excursions by train. Now, Sir Morton Peto, having completed the line to Southend, then had a new housing estate built immediately south of the railway line, built by Lucas Brothers for Peto's company. He built a similar estate at Lowestoft to attract a body of commuter traffic, as well as attracting wealthy buyers. Peto offered reduced season ticket fares for takers of Clifftown properties. The Clifftown itself was laid out on a plan around a series of greens. And on completion, 11 of the properties were advertised as boarding or lodging houses. By 1866, this figure was 22. And these obviously would have been lodging houses, boarding houses for the more affluent of the people coming to Southend. Nelson Street, part of Clifftown, was the commercial heart of the new estate, with shops on the ground floor and accommodation above. And in fact, the whole of Clifftown really is very much as it was built, and particularly Nelson Street. It's very, very similar now, apart from the shops having gone. Almost immediately following the completion of the rail line, the London, Tilbury and Southend Company were advertising excursion trains to Southend. In July 1860, 400 members and friends of the Clerkenwell Working Men's Institute went on excursion by train to the well-known and pleasant place of Cockney Resort. The railway were advertising cheap trips from Fenchurch Street Station to Southend New Town, first class 3 and 6, second class 2 shillings and 6pence. This was about the same price, or slightly less, than travelling by steam packet, and of course, much quicker. It was not long, however, before the influx of excursionists was causing comment. John Morris, a businessman from London who was interested in taking over the running of the pier, wrote to the local press that residents and visitors, i.e. middle-class visitors, should have precedence over excursionists on the pier. And we see on the lower half of the picture here, you see these excursionists on the beach at Southend, probably around about 1890. In 1877, the Southend Standard newspaper invited boarding house keepers and hotels to send them lists of visitors each week during the season. These, of course, were those visitors, mainly middle class, who were staying probably for the week or more. It would be interesting to do an analysis of all these reports in the paper, all these lists in the paper, to see who was coming back week after week or season after season, and if they were staying in the same places. And of course, Southend wasn't the only place to have such visitors lists. Most resorts began to print visitors lists in newspapers in the sort of second half of the 19th century. But the vast majority of those coming to Southend, particularly following the Bank Holiday Act of 1871, were excursionists or day trippers. These were frequently referred in the press as the lower classes of excursionists. And this lovely cartoon comes from the Southend and Westcliff Graphic in the early 20th century. The beach fronting marine parade, and this is the picture here. This picture was taken around about 1890 and shows lots and lots of excursionists, some of whom were probably about ready to go for a sail in one of the small boats there. The number of excursionists increased dramatically in the later 19th century. And here you see them making the most of their day by the sea. And most of the excursionists would have congregated on this beach, which was east of the pier. Although a combination of rising living standards, coupled with the Bank Holiday Act of 1871, resulted in more excursionists arriving at the seaside, organised charitable and firms outings were often the only way for the very poorest of the East London inhabitants to experience the seaside. In 1874, William Booth appealed for funds on behalf of his Christian mission to take 5,000 poor people for a day to Southend. In 1893, the West Ham Board of Guardians organised a day excursion to Southend for its inmates and staff. Firms outings to Southend became a regular annual event. These included, for example, the Matchbox Girls from Bryant May's factory at Bow. There were many complaints addressed to the press about the useless, unruly rabble coming to Southend. In reply to that particular letter, a correspondent wrote, "This is the only seaside resort that the very poorest of our London factory hands and matchbox girls can be brought to and taken home again for 1 and 6pence, which was a special excursion fare organised by the firms." Other organised groups included the temperance societies, and there were several temperance hotels in Southend at this time. This included the Central Temperance Association in 1886 and the United Juvenile Order of the Total Abstinent Sons of the Phoenix, who had an excursion to Southend in 1894. This just happens to be a picture of the Hastings group. In 1888, the direct or short route to Southend on the London Tilbury and Southend Railway via Pitsea was opened, cutting the journey time from 95 to 55 minutes. And the importance of that, apart from encouraging more excursions to come, was that people working in London would now see living in Southend as a viable proposition, managed to get to London by 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning quite easily. Then in 1889, the new Great Eastern Railway line from London to Liverpool Street opened, the effect of which can be seen on this chart of visitors on the 3 days of August, bank holidays, Saturday to Monday, between 1873 and 1910. With the opening of the second line to Southend, there was intense competition between the rail companies, keeping fares very low. And you can see the enormous increase in passenger traffic on August bank holiday to Southend between 1890, when the line fully opened, the new GER line, and 1910. In 1889 to 90, Southend's new pier opened. with increased accommodation for steamships and pedestrians. On the left is the old pier, this lovely lantern slide picture of about 1880, and the new pier taken in 1890. And this chart shows the steamship passengers landed and embarked at Southend from 1893, when reliable figures first begin. And there's a steady increase, although, of course, like any chart showing visitor figures, it's very reliant on the weather. So 1888 was a very bad year, for example, before this started, but 1899 seems to be a fairly poor year weather-wise as well, probably. And the ship, by the way, the paddle steamer, is the Southend Belle. Let's look at providing amusements at the seaside for the excursionists. Excuse me. The Southend Local Board, and then the Municipal Borough Council after 1892, licensed various seasonal entertainers, normally only those who could prove a local address for the season. Albert Vallow, on the left here, sorry about the quality of the picture, it's the only one I could find. I used it because we know more about him than anybody else, really. Albert Vallow was a ventriloquist and an illusionist whose home was in Edgware Road in London, but in the season, he took up residence in Beresford Road, Southend, and performed on the beach between 1896 and 1910 with his 6 dolls. In the winter, he provided entertainments for children's parties in and around the London area. The Jolly Boys were perhaps the most famous of the minstrel groups in Southend. Here they are performing on their stand on the East Beach about 1905. Now, most of the licenses awarded by the local authority to seasonal entertainers confine these entertainers to the east of the pier. The Marine Park was established by Albert Tolhurst at the east end of the town. Now, Tolhurst was a solicitor, businessman, and developer and so on, speculator, I suppose you'd call him, who was based in Gravesend. But in 1892, he opened a branch in Southend, headed by his son, Bernard Wiltshire. And they bought up a plot of land at the east end of Southend for the building of this marine park, with a little 4-acre annex in the park for amusements. In at the very end of the 19th century, there were plans to build a new entrance to the marine park by the Kersal and Southend, sorry, the Margate and Kersals, I'll get it right in a minute, the Margate and Southend Kersals Company. And this was opened in 1901, although there was never actually a Kersal built at Margate. And very soon, especially after the First World War, the Kersal amusement park was to become the largest in the south of England. This is one of the early rides from 1894. This is the aerial flight. In 1898, the Warwick Revolving Tower was opened in Southend. There were several of these Warwick Revolving Towers about the country. Another one, for example, was at Great Yarmouth. This one was taken down in 1905 following a series of mishaps. For example, the circular lift or platform which took people from the base to the top sometimes got stuck at the top, and also the structure swayed around in the wind, but alarmingly. So it was taken down in 1905. One of the favourite enjoyments of the excursionists was going for a ride or going for a sail. And this rather overcrowded boat would probably cause heart failure to many a health and safety executive these days. And a rather lovely picture of excursionists on Southend Beach around about 1900. In about 1880, Harry Absalom, Southend, from a very old Southend family, moored 2 old barges off Southend Pier and converted them to swimming baths. So they always had between 4 and 5 feet of water in them. One of these baths was for women and children, and another one for men. So you could go swimming in these baths at any state of the tide. And that's the interior of the children and women's bath. Southend was only one of 2 resorts to have floating baths, apparently. On the cliffs, there was a Happy Valley bandstand, originally placed on top of the cliffs, but when the new bandstand was built there, the old wooden one was taken down and rebuilt here, halfway down the cliffs. And pier row groups used to form here from about 1910. The numbers of lodging and boarding houses grew rapidly towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, with increased demand. In 1874, almost half of the recorded lodging houses were in Clifftown. Generally, it was only the more affluent visitors who would be able to afford to stay for a few days, of course. But the most remarkable of the growth areas was in fact in catering, and refreshment houses and dining rooms saw a 10-fold increase between 1874 and 1908. That's the green bar on this diagram. And compare it with Clacton, you can see Clacton's rise was similar in the number of boarding houses, though Southend began to overtake Clacton in the early 20th century in the number of boarding houses. Now, many of the boarding houses were in fact along Marine Parade. This is a view of the western end of Marine Parade, just before you get to the hill going up to the new town or Royal Terrace. And these very grand houses would have been converted to boarding and lodging houses in the second half of the 19th century, particularly after about 1880. Frederick Chancellor, the famous architect, owned plots of land on Pier Hill, which he had purchased in 1881. He leased this plot of ground on Pier Hill for use as a fairground. But following a large number of complaints, and we'll come back to the fairground a bit later on, about the fairground, the Chancellor put forward plans for a first-class modern hotel, to which he said people of education and refinement who would raise the moral tone of the place would go. The hotel was never built. He couldn't raise the funds, apparently. But the stated ambition to improve the moral tone of the place was a common one. The last decade of the 19th century saw the building of several large hotels in the town. The Queen's Hotel, built for John James Wagstaff at Westcliff, would have no accommodation for trippers, it was said. The Hotel Victoria at the north end of High Street was built for P.J. Burdett, another developer. And the Hotel Metropole on Pier Hill was built for Alfred Tolhurst. These were all for the more affluent of the staying visitors, although the Metropole was also advertised for the thousands of people who come to Southend every year. Although whether they could have afforded to stay there is another matter. Then we come to the final section, looking at the potential conflicts and the resolution of those conflicts between the better class of excursionists and the day trippers, and the matter of social zoning. Thomas Arnold was tenant farmer of the old Thames farm at the eastern end of the town. He wrote in August 1882 to the local press, "If East London is to be let loose and 30,000 of its number poured into Southend on the first Monday in August from this year forward, Something must be done for the protection of property in this district. My farm, he says, is at the east end of the town, and hence the first to suffer from this plague of locusts. And he ends his letter by saying, Southend has become the playground for the lower classes of excursionists. Now back to the Pier Hill Fairground. Remember, that was built on the land belonging to Frederick Chancellor. In a letter to the Southend Standard in August 1893, a correspondent wrote, "Here is the Pier Hill, which should and could be made to form one of the most attractive features of the town, but is disgraceful and debased to the level of an East End pandemonium." And the fairground, another description, was devoted all the year round to swings, roundabouts, aerial railways, shooting galleries, coconut shies, booths, caravans, and all the other delightful open-air amusements, which are the distinguishing feature of a fair. Now, of course, this would have been very distressing to the sort of middle-class visitor who hadn't experienced such awful goings-on and didn't want to either. And another correspondent wrote, "If the town cannot exist without such sounds and scenes, surely it might be possible to arrange for their location nearer the gasworks." Correspondent wrote also to the local paper, "Are we as ratepayers compelled to have forced upon us by the low charges of the railway companies such a tribe of unruly, useless rabble with no guarantee of anything in the shape of order and behaviour? Our most respectable visitors do not hesitate in saying their holidays next season were spent elsewhere, and no wonder, what with low excursionists, quack doctors, wretched street bands, organ grinders, mock auctions, Sunday traders, fruit touters, low public houses, etc. Southend can be a prosperous, respectable town if properly managed. If badly managed, it will be Whitechapel on Sea, or worse." Now, the reactions to the excursionists were in fact more a result of the numbers of visitors rather than simply their presence or behaviour. Now, interestingly, in slightly earlier than that last quotation in 1893, there was a so-called riot in Southend with a group of excursionists from a Plaistow timber works, cause a fracas on the seafront. And the police had to call the army out in from Shoebury to quell them and get rid of them and so on. But in fact, the local paper reported the riot, but said the vast majority of excursionists were very well behaved. So the opinion of one or two correspondents shouldn't be taken as the opinion of everybody. So it is in fact the numbers really, rather than their presence, which was causing a problem. And if you look at this chart, you can see how the number of visitors just on August bank holiday, that's for 3 days, far exceeded the resident population. This is a very crude sketch map of Southend seafront showing the pier, the black line in the middle there, with Western Esplanade and Westcliff to the west, a marine parade, and the gasworks we just mentioned to the east with the cursor as well. For many years, we can see the Westcliff, which was developed as very much a middle-class housing estate or series of housing estates. Westcliff was the place where the better class of excursionists went. You can see from this picture here from Southend Museum, showing a group of middle-class visitors or maybe even residents walking along the Esplanade. And on the east side of the pier, with the Warwick Tower in the background, picture taken about 1900 or 1902, with excursionists on the beach. For many years, the local authority, through licensing, had restricted the majority of seasonal itinerant entertainers and hawkers to the east side of the pier. And for some years, the western side, Western Esplanade, had been reserved for the more affluent visitors, a majority of the more affluent residents. These images say, date from around about 1903 or so. This is a picture of Marine Parade, probably about 1910, with the East Parade bandstand. You can see just in the middle of the picture there. Now, by this stage, Marine Parade had been widened and paved over. All the greens had gone by this stage to accommodate the ever-increasing number of excursionists. The local authority accepting that this is a major part of the lifeblood of the town. Alderman Brightwell in 1910 said that the town should now consider the advisability of catering for someone above the tea and shrimp element. The town to the west of the pier should be kept to induce a different class to come into the town. They should make a dividing line of the pier, one side kept for the respectable families, keeping the east for the excursionist element where they are catered for. And Brightwell wanted the council to enshrine the division of the two classes in law. And I should say here that Brightwell, Alderman Brightwell, was the owner of a very, very high class drapers at the bottom end of the high street, not very far from the entrance to the pier. And he didn't want, obviously, the excursionists to drive away his middle class customers. And also it should be mentioned that this statement in council in 1910 was in the minority. And also it should be stated, of course, at the end of this talk, that Brightwell's views were a good 20 years out of date, because social zoning, which is what he is trying to ingrain in law, had been a fact in Southend for at least 20 years. Thank you very much.